Right behind me is the population of the world in 2100. In 2022, this is how many people live on Earth: 7.9 billion people. Using projections, we can see how the population of the Earth will develop over time. Projections are of course never more than well-informed guesses, but they give us a rough idea of where we are heading. We will come back to that later. One marker on this map represents 1 million people, and colors represent different regions. In 2023, we will pass 8 billion people globally, and the year after, the Democratic Republic of Congo and Vietnam passes 100 million inhabitants respectively. By 2027, India passes China as the most populous nation in the world, at 1,469 million inhabitants. Iraq and Algeria pass 50 million by 2030, and the year after, Indonesia passes 300 million. Argentina passes 50 million in 2033, and Angola does the same in 2034. By 2031, over 5 billion people live in Asia, and by 2037, we pass 9 billion people globally. But already we are seeing tendencies to population stagnation and decline, not only in Europe. Japan is falling significantly and passes under 120 million by 2032. Thailand is stagnating at around 70 million, and the second most populous nation of China is just passing over 1.45 billion before starting to decline. But Africa is still at this time growing faster and faster, and the continent passes 2 billion by the end of the 2030s. Angola and Mozambique passes 50 million, and Tanzania passes 100 million before the end of the decade. And the most populous nation on the continent, Nigeria, passes 300 million by 2036. In the early 2040s, Niger passes 50 million, and Pakistan now stands at over 300 million. Neighboring India is passing 1.6 billion, at around the same time as the population of Brazil is stagnating at 230 million. By 2047, Nigeria is the third most populous nation in the world, passing the United States. Côte d'Ivoire passes 50 million in 2049, just as Ethiopia passes 200 million. The Democratic Republic of Congo stands at over 200 million by 2052, but by then Nigeria has passed 400 million. Densely populated Bangladesh is stagnating already by the early 2050s, at around 190 million inhabitants, and that is one of the contributing factors to the Asian continent as a whole stagnating at 5.3 billion in the 2050s. Another is that Japan now falls below 100 million for the first time since the 1960s. In the Middle East, population is stagnating towards the end of the decade, with Saudi Arabia topping out at around 45 million, and Turkey falling just short of 100 million. Yemen is still growing and passes 50 million in 2055. Now Africa is the only continent that is growing fast, even though the population growth in the US and Canada means that North America is steadily ticking upward. Mali and Burkina Faso pass 50 million by 2058, and in the same year Kenya and Uganda passes 100 million. By 2057, the world passes 10 billion inhabitants for the first time in history. The world has almost 4 times as many humans as 100 years earlier. By the end of the decade, Nigeria is approaching 500 million inhabitants and passes that milestone in 2064 as the third nation in history. We see Angola pass 100 million in 2062, Sudan in 2064, and Nigeria in 2068. Zambia passes 50 million in 2064, Malawi in 2068, and Somalia in 2069. And the African continent as a whole has now passed 3 billion inhabitants. In Italy, the population is falling below 50 million, almost exactly 100 years after the nation passed that level in 1961. The United States is, as mentioned, still growing and passes 400 million by 2067, but neighboring Mexico is now stagnating just short of 160 million. India peaks at around 1.65 billion, and by then China is falling fast. Indonesia stagnates alongside most of Southeast Asian nations and tops out at 338 million inhabitants. Canada passes 50 million in 2070, but now the only significant growth we can see is in Africa. Most nations of the world is now in population decline. Chad passes 50 million in 2076 and Senegal the year after. Mozambique passes 100 million in 2078. Tanzania passes 200 million in 2073 and Egypt does the same in 2075. The Democratic Republic of Congo passes 300 million in 2078. A year after, Nigeria passes 600 million. Small Burundi has by the 2070s tripled its population from today. At the same time as most African nations have many decades of fast population growth behind them, and with some of them doubling its population in just one generation, we see some small indications of the growth slowing down, and South Africa is stagnating at around 80 million by the end of the 2070s. The population decline in Asia is picking up speed by the 2080s. Now, all of the most populous nations are declining, with China and India dropping with as much as 6 or 7 million inhabitants per year. The exception is Pakistan, which is still growing into the 2090s before stagnating. In 2081, Pakistan passes 400 million. The Philippines stagnates at around 150 million by 2080. A few years later, Iraq passes 100 million, and Brazil falls down below 200 million in 2084. Burundi passes 50 million, and the African continent passes 4 billion in 2090. By 2100, Africa has not yet stagnated in population, but is now growing with a much slower rate than a few decades earlier. Nigeria has now passed 700 million inhabitants. Ethiopia is just under 300 million by the end of the century, with Tanzania not far after. Madagascar and Cote d'Ivoire are close to reaching 100 million, and Angola is close to 200 million. Small Benin and Guinea stands at close to 50 million respectively. India falls to the levels of today by the end of the century at 1.4 billion. China is by now close to falling below 1 billion, leaving India alone above that level. Japan is now down at 75 million at the end of the century, and South Korea is at 29 million, down from 51 today. In Eastern Europe, population has fallen fast during the 21st century, and some of the nations have close to just half of the population of today, including, for example, Ukraine and Bulgaria. Russia has seen some decline as well, but not to the same extent as some of its closest neighbors. Southern Europe sees population decline, more so than in, for example, Germany, France, the UK and the Scandinavian nations. In the Americas, apart from the US and Canada, most nations see population decline by now. Globally, the world is close to stagnating at 10.8 billion inhabitants. This was made using the United Nations Population Division's median projections for 2020 to 2100. Projections are based on a number of factors, like official governmental statistics and censuses, alongside other demographic surveys. While some nations do have reliable sources, dating many decades back, obviously others do not. So some level of extrapolating is always involved when producing demographic data. Historical and current day fertility rates are the major base for changes in population, and when data is lacking, the numbers of neighboring nations with similar demographics and levels of development can be used as the basis. In this video, we have used the median projection, which indicates a world with, as mentioned, 10.8 billion people by 2100. The UN low estimate has the world population peak already in the 2050s at 9 billion, and then drop to 7.3 billion by 2100, below the global population of today. In Empty Planet, Ricker and Ibbotson argues that the UN relies too much on historical data and will most likely fail to predict the sharp decline in fertility that will take place in Africa, just as it has in Latin America and Asia in the last few decades. Others point to the African fertility rates up until now staying higher than expected when compared to the development in Latin America and Asia. Fertility rates is too big of a topic for this video, but what we can be sure of is that the number of babies born per woman will impact, alongside how many of those babies that survive and grow up, the size of the population. But other, more difficult to predict factors can of course impact the population, like economic development, and more extreme like epidemics and pandemics, conflicts and refugee flows. Many of the European nations that today have fertility rates below point of reproduction have in the last few decades compensated that with an increase in immigration. Changes in immigration policy can impact future population levels quite drastically. Today, the fertility rate is the highest in many African nations, alongside a few other scattered examples around the globe. While the share of the global population that Asia and Africa together make up will not change much until 2100, up from 77% to 83%. The balance within will change, and by 2100 the population of Africa will make up close to 40% of the total population of the Earth, up from 18% today. There is no doubt that a tripling population in Africa comes with challenges. Africa is the poorest continent, and many babies are still today born into poverty. This could lead to greater risk for unrest and refugee flows away from poor economic opportunities. But on the other hand, these grim outlooks are most likely only true for some of the worst off nations, torn by conflict and poor health. In many African nations, the economy is booming, and the larger, younger population, compared to all other continents, could help that development along. But to use that resource efficiently, many nations must step up their investments in human capital, most notably in educational opportunities. Africa today is a continent of both many low-income nations, but also many middle-income nations. There is still great potential in African agriculture, and with economic development, yields could increase per acre. But challenges remain in some parts as to how well food outputs will be able to meet the needs of a growing population. Many of the tropical diseases like malaria are still today taking its toll on the African population, but these are fought hard globally today, and major improvements in efficiency and availability of vaccines and medicine have been made in the last couple of decades. How well implemented family planning measures are across the African continent, and the access to contraceptives, will of course also impact the fertility rate and future population levels. To what degree the well-functioning and the aspiring democracies in Africa will impact their authoritarian neighbors is also unknown to take into consideration. Women's access to education, economic independence, and influence within the family and community are major contributing factors to the fertility rate, and it does, to say the least, vary across the continent today. So what will happen in a world where population is declining in most nations? Well, the short answer is that we do not really know. We have not been in this situation before. The few nations that are already seeing a drop in population can give us hints, but the reasons behind the early decline is so different that one should be careful to make too much out of it. Clearly, these nations are not falling apart from the minute population is stagnating, but some economic challenges come with an increase in old age dependency, where a smaller base of a population pyramid is supporting a larger, older top. Some nations will be more prepared to handle this than others. A world with fewer people, demanding less resources, could mean emissions can be lowered with less effort, but it is far from inevitable. We will probably see the average lifespan go up, and maybe living to 100 will be commonplace for the children of today, and that could impact the population levels and the need for resources to some extent. But to be absolutely sure of what the future holds, we will just have to wait and see. This was made using thousands of markers and over 6,000 images. If you like what I do, you can check out more content on my channel. And if you subscribe and activate notifications, you're more likely to see what I make in the future. Thank you so much for watching.